Welcome, my fellow attorneys, to the National Bankruptcy Academy video series. I'm your host, Robert Schaller, an attorney with over 34 years of experience and a registered certified public accountant. Today, we'll be discussing the voluntary petition and related documents with a line-by-line analysis and real-world commentary. I hope you enjoyed the video. Every individual seeking Chapter 7 bankruptcy relief commences a case by filing a petition. But what constitutes a petition? Unlike the U.S. district courts that give great latitude to drafters of a civil complaint, the U.S. bankruptcy courts do not give similar latitude to drafters of a Chapter 7 petition. Instead, the bankruptcy rules require an individual seeking bankruptcy relief to use a specific national form prescribed by the Judicial Conference of the United States. These rules are strictly enforced. The petition form may not be changed as to affect wording or the order of presenting information. This course focuses on the petition titled Official Form 101, Voluntary Petition for Individuals Filing for Bankruptcy. This form applies only in cases filed by individuals. This form must be contrasted with other types of petitions used by non-individual debtors, such as corporations. However, for simplicity, the current Official Form 101, Voluntary Petition for Individuals Filing for Bankruptcy, shall simply be referred to as the petition. A bankruptcy petition can be filed by a person alone or by a person and his or her spouse together. A bankruptcy case filed by a person alone is called an individual case. A bankruptcy case filed by a person and his or her spouse together is called a joint case. An individual filing for bankruptcy relief is called a debtor. Now, let's turn our attention to this bankruptcy form with a line-by-line analysis with real-world commentary. I hope you enjoy the video. Today we're going to be talking about the voluntary petition for individuals filing for bankruptcy, Official Form 101. It's important to note that there are many types of petitions. Today we're only going to focus on the voluntary petition for individuals. At the top of the form, there's a box that says fill in this information to identify your case. This box allows the court to know in what court are you going to be filing the bankruptcy case. And there's a pull-down menu, so let's explore that. Here it says United States Bankruptcy Court for the, and with a pull-down menu, you'll identify which district in which you're going to file the bankruptcy case. We're using an example today of George and Martha Washington, and they live in the Eastern District of Virginia. So I'll pull down the menu, and we're going to search for the Eastern District of Virginia. And there it is. So I'll click on that. The next they ask is, what is the case number, if known? Now, in the beginning of a case, before it is filed, there is no case number. It is just simply information on your computer. Once the case is actually filed with the clerk of the U.S. Bankruptcy Court, the clerk will assign a case number, and all future pleadings must have that case number on it. But for this example of George and Martha Washington, there is no case number because the case has not yet been filed. So we'll leave that blank. Next to the right, it says, what chapter are you filing under? Of course, the attorney must know what is the chapter that they're seeking relief for. Chapter 7, Chapter 11, Chapter 12, or Chapter 13. The focus of this video is Chapter 7, a consumer bankruptcy. So we're going to check the Chapter 7 box. To the far right over here is another box, and it's labeled, check if this is an amended filing. This is not amended filing. This is the first time the case is going to be filed, so this box would not be checked in the example of George and Martha Washington. However, if it was an amended filing, then you would go ahead and check the box as I'm doing now, and then you'd move back over to the case number if known, and you would enter the case number in. For example, 20B12345. But since this is a fictitious case of George and Martha Washington, the case has not yet been filed. This would be left blank. So I'm going to delete the case number. And I'm also going to uncheck the box to the right because it is not an amended filing. Next, we have to review down below the instructions for Official Form 101, the voluntary petition. The instructions say the bankruptcy form uses you and debtor 1 to refer to a debtor filing a loan. A married couple may file a bankruptcy case together called the joint case. And in joint cases, these forms use you to ask for information from both debtors. For example, If a form asks, do you own a car? The answer would be yes if either debtor owns a car. When information is needed about the spouses separately, the form uses debtor 1 and debtor 2 to distinguish between them. In joint cases, one of the spouses must report information as debtor 1 and the other as debtor 2. The same person must be debtor 1 in all of the forms. Now let's move down the form to part 1. Part 1 is titled Identify Yourself. And if you'll notice, there's 2 columns. One says About Debtor 1, and the second column says About Debtor 2. Throughout these forms, we're going to distinguish between Debtor 1 and Debtor 2 depending on the portion of the form. So here on line 1, it's called Your Full Name. Write the name that is on your government-issued picture identification, for example, a driver's license or passport. And make sure you use the exact name that's on the driver's license. Because later on, when the debtors at the Section 341 meeting of creditors, they're going to be comparing the name on the petition with the name on the government ID, so make it exact. So for example, in this case, we have George and Martha Washington. So the first name would be George. He has no middle name, and the last name is Washington. Over here on debtor 2, they want the second spouse. That would be Martha Washington. She has no middle name either. And neither one of them have a suffix, like a junior, a senior, a second, or a third. If they did, then that would be appropriately labeled in the box below the last name. Now line 2 says, list all other names that the debtor has used in the last 8 years, including any married or maiden names. So for example, if George Washington had a nickname like Gabby, or just an abbreviation like GEO, you'd include that name. And the reason you do that is they want to make sure that creditors are listed and creditors can identify who in fact is actually filing the bankruptcy. So for example, if George Washington completed a loan application using the name Gabby Washington, then it would be difficult for the creditor to realize that this George Washington who's filing the bankruptcy is the same as the Gabby Washington that was a lessee under, say, a car lease. So let's use Gabby Washington under line 2. Now over here on debtor 2, which is the wife Martha, let's assume in this particular case George and Martha were married 5 years ago. Then she would have been using her maiden name within the last 8 years. That is, the 3 years prior to the 5 years that they've been married. So in her name, let's say her name was Martha Dandridge. That's her maiden name. Now let's move down to question 3. Question 3 asks the debtor to list the last 4 digits of the Social Security number or Federal Individual Taxpayer Identification. Notice that the first 5 digits are X'd out, XX-XX, and then leaving room for the 4 remaining digits. So let's say that George Washington's last 4 digits are 1, 2, 3, 4. And let's further say that Martha's last 4 digits are 4, 3, 2, 1. Now notice that question 3 says to list the Social Security or Individual Taxpayer Identification number. So what is an ITIN number? Well, the Individual Taxpayer Identification number is a 9-digit number issued by the U.S. Internal Revenue Service to individuals who are required for U.S. federal tax purposes to have a U.S. taxpayer identification number, but who do not have and are not eligible to get a Social Security number. So, for example, let's assume you're an alien resident who's allowed to work in the United States, but is not issued a Social Security card. They may be issued an ITIN number by the Social Security Administration. So when they fill out a tax return, they would use the ITIN where other people might use a Social Security number. And on this particular form in the bankruptcy court, the voluntary petition, they would use the ITIN number instead of the Social Security number. In a very rare case, you would have both, but if you were to have both, then that might be a red flag to an attorney that one of the numbers might be illegal. For example, someone who is illegally using someone else's social security number. So that'd be a red flag. But in a normal case, you would have either one or the other, and you list it here on line 3. So let's move down to line 4. At the very top of page 2, there's a bar that says debtor 1. And I wish the form said debtor 1 and debtor 2, because you're supposed to put both debtors' names down if this is a joint case. So in this case, we put down George and Martha Washington. And I'm sure the header is there so that it appears on all future pages. So if the staple ever came out on a physical document, or if it ever got separated on an electronic document, then they would know what name applies to the various pages. To the far right, there's a case number if known. That means if this is an amended petition, as we talked about earlier. Since this is the first petition and the case has not yet been filed, the case number is left blank. So let's move on to line 4. Line 4 asks the debtor to identify any business names and employer identification numbers that have been used in the last 8 years. And the employer identification number is sometimes called the EIN. So what is that? Well, an employer identification number is a 9-digit number assigned by the IRS. So it's sort of like the ITIN. But the EIN number is used to identify the tax accounts of employers and certain others who have no employees. The IRS uses the number to identify taxpayers who are required to file various business tax returns. EINs are used by employers, sole proprietors, corporations, and partnerships. So in this particular case, George Washington has a EIN number because he is a sole proprietor of a business. Okay, so we would fill in the business name on the first box, and that is Cherry Tree Services. The second line below is also a business name in case the debtor has more than one business. And the EIN number is identified for the business, which I've just added. Now over here on debtor 2, that's Martha Washington, they ask the same thing. Does she own any business that has a business name or employer identification number? But in our example, she does not. So we're going to check the box here saying, I have not used any business names or EINs. So let's move down to question 5. Question 5 asks, where does the debtor live? Which is really a residence question. What is the debtor's residence? So you'd put down the street residence of where they live. So in this case, we're putting down 3200 Mount Vernon. And that's in the city of Mount Vernon in the state of Virginia with a zip code of 22121. And it also asks for the county. Now that's important because within each state, there's a federal bankruptcy court. Some states have more than one federal bankruptcy court. And typically, they decide which court is the appropriate court depending on the county that the debtor lives in. So within, for example, Chicago, the federal bankruptcy court sitting in Chicago covers many counties. And that would be Lake County and Will County and Cook County, for example, and DuPage, and some other counties. And they would look to see where does the debtor live. And if they live in that county, they're assigned to the bankruptcy court of that district. So make sure the county is accurate. Over to the right, it says if debtor 2 lives at a different address, add that. In this particular example, Martha Washington lives with George Washington, so it is not a different address. Again, they're only looking for a different address, so I would leave this blank. Now notice the boxes below on line 5, the bottom boxes. The instructions say if your mailing address is different from the one above, fill it in here. So if the mailing address is the same as your residence, then you just leave this blank. But sometimes it's a different address. So for example, somebody might want to have important mail sent to a post office box, in which case they would then put that information here. So they're not claiming they live or reside at the post office, it's just where they want to get their mail. So let's assume in this example that he wants to send it